Hello everyone. Let's go ahead and get started with a fresh project. You can name it whatever you want. That shouldn't be too big of a deal. We're going to go ahead and target API 21 as our minimum. You can lower it. That won't affect anything in the course. That's just what I personally target for new apps nowadays. And then we are going to start with an empty activity. We'll keep the defaults for the activity and layout. All right, let's switch to project view. So the first thing we're going to do is get all of our dependencies set up. And we're going to use a technique where we can define all of our versions in our top level build.gradle file. This will make it easier to keep things consistent as we're importing different libraries. We're going to use the extra properties extension in Gradle to define our versions. So these are all of the dependency versions that we're going to need for this first lesson. And we'll go over each one individually once we actually get to use them. But for now, you can go ahead and copy it, and these files will be in the notes for the lesson. So to take advantage of these, we'll open our apps build.gradle file. And I'm going to go ahead and remove the things we're not going to be using. So we're not going to have any manually added jar files. We are not going to be using constraint layout. And so the first thing we can do here is, instead of having a version defined like this, we can go ahead and reference our variable that we just defined in the project level build.gradle. And to do that, you use a $sign, and this was support library version. And when you do references like this, you do have to use the double quotes, not the single quotes. And Android Studio should offer you a quick fix, which they do. So we'll go ahead, hit Alt-Enter, and accept their quick fix. We are also going to be using the design library, so we'll add that. All right, and the first kind of third-party library we'll be referencing is Dagger. And Dagger has several artifacts. So this first one here is just the core Dagger classes. This gives us the annotations. And then they do have an Android artifact, which is the one right below it. And that gives us kind of an injector pattern for Android specific objects like activities and so on. And then for each, there is an annotation processor artifact. So these, we use annotation processor rather than implementation because they do not need to be included in our final APK. So these just run during the annotation processing phase of the build. And this is where you can see the having versions defined in one place helps a lot, because otherwise we would have to put the Dagger version 4 times, and when we go to update that, we'd have to remember to update it 4 times. Now we just have it in one spot. We are also going to be using retrofit for our network requests. And then we're going to use Moshi, or Moshi, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that, from Square, which will, that's our serialization and deserialization library for our models. So it's very similar to JSON. You could also use Jackson in place of that. I prefer Moshi, so we're going to go with that. And we're also going to use auto value, and Ryan Harder has an extension for auto value that will generate the serializers and deserializers for our auto value objects with Moshi. So we'll go ahead and add that. Then we actually need our auto value dependencies. So we'll add that. Auto value does not have any runtime dependencies. So these are only used during the build phase of the project, and that's why we use compile only and annotation processor. So all we need at runtime are the files that auto value generates, and then we're good to go. We will also be using RxJava. And along with that, Jake Wharton has a library called RxRelay, and relays are just RxJava subjects without terminal events. So those have very specific use cases, which again we'll go over once we actually get to using them. And lastly, we will add Conductor. Conductor is a library that is essentially a drop-in replacement for fragments. For several reasons, we aren't going to be using fragments in this course. The main one is the backstack is much easier to inspect and manipulate in Conductor versus the fragment manager, and we'll see why that's important soon. However, everything we do in this course is doable with fragments, and if there is enough of a demand, I will absolutely show or have a lesson that has fragments swapped in for controllers once the project is finished, so we can see how to do that with fragments. However, I do believe controllers have enough benefits with their simpler life cycle, and learning Conductor as a whole is very low barrier to entry. Like I said, it's almost a complete drop-in replacement for fragments, and obviously we'll get more into that as we go along. But that's what that dependency is. Up here in the Android block, we also need to reference those versions that we have in our top level build.gradle. So to do that, it'll be a little bit different than the dependencies block. We'll get root project reference.our extension properties, and then the variable name. And same for our min SDK and target SDK. All right. We're going to go ahead and replace constraint layout since we're not using it and actually don't even have it in the app anymore. So we'll just, for now, have a frame layout to act as our activity layout. So let's go ahead and run a sync, make sure all of our artifacts are resolvable, and looks good. The last thing we want to do is ProGuard. So if you're going to be using ProGuard on the project, a lot of third-party libraries will tell you some rules to add to make sure that it's compatible. Retrofit and Moshi both have ProGuard rules that should be added, and so we'll go ahead and do that right now, as I highly recommend you do use ProGuard. All right. So here on the Moshi page, we have some rules here. We'll just go ahead, copy that. Go to our app modules ProGuard rules. We'll go ahead and label it so we know what they're for. And then we also have one for retrofit, which we can get right here. And this is on the retrofit page near the bottom as well. All right, so now I have ProGuard rules added. Our dependencies are all resolved, and we can move on creating our application scope next. See you then.